The fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked the end of one of the world's most powerful empires. From its creation in 1922, the USSR grew into a global superpower that dominated the entire eastern half of Europe. At its height, it controlled vast territories stretching across Eurasia, maintained the second-largest economy in the world, and stood as one of two superpowers in a Cold War that defined the second half of the 20th century. Yet despite its influence and might, the Soviet Union lasted only about 70 years before collapsing entirely. How did such a massive state, with one of the largest militaries and most expansive territories in history, unravel so quickly? The answer lies in a combination of disasters, policies, wars, and public discontent that slowly ate away at the foundations of the Soviet system. One of the most significant turning points came in 1986, with the nuclear disaster at Chernobyl. The explosion released radioactive fallout over large parts of Europe, about 400 times more than the Hiroshima bomb. Instead of warning the people, Soviet leaders tried to cover it up. May Day parades went on as usual, citizens continued their daily lives, and only when radiation sickness spread did the government finally acknowledge the catastrophe. When Mikhail Gorbachev, the last president of the U.S.S.R, eventually addressed the crisis, he downplayed it and blamed Western lies. But the truth could no longer be hidden. For many Soviet citizens, the Chernobyl cover-up shattered trust in their government. Gorbachev himself would later admit that the disaster played a decisive role in the collapse of the Union, saying it shook the very legitimacy of the state. In an effort to restore faith and modernize the Soviet Union, Gorbachev introduced two major reforms. Glasnost, meaning openness, was designed to give people greater freedom of speech, press, and religion. For the first time in decades, Soviet citizens could openly criticize the government without as much fear of imprisonment. Newspapers published scandals, previously banned books circulated, and long-silenced voices found an audience. Ironically, instead of rebuilding trust, it exposed the rot within the system. The truth about Chernobyl and many other hidden failures of the state spread rapidly, and the Communist Party's authority began to crumble. Perestroika, or restructuring, sought to reform the Soviet economy by combining elements of capitalism with socialism, similar to what China had done a few years earlier. It also allowed for limited democratic elections. At first, many citizens were hopeful. Perhaps the Soviet Union could modernize and catch up with the West. But instead of strengthening the system, these reforms revealed its weaknesses. State-run industries could not adapt to competition, corruption thrived, and shortages of basic goods only worsened. Citizens saw the failures of communism more clearly, and the Communist Party lost much of its once unshakable authority. Even before Gorbachev's reforms, the Soviet economy had been in decline. While it once rivaled the West in industrial production, it failed to meet consumer needs. Ordinary citizens lived with shortages of food, clothing, and basic goods, while the government poured resources into heavy industry and the military. This disconnect between military strength and everyday life created growing frustration. The people could see that the United States, despite being their great rival, provided its citizens with a much higher standard of living. The war in Afghanistan, launched in 1979, only made things worse. Intended as a short intervention to prop up a communist government, it turned into a decade-long conflict often compared to America's Vietnam War. Soviet soldiers fought in harsh conditions against determined Afghan resistance fighters supplied with weapons by the United States. The war drained billions from the already struggling Soviet economy, cost the lives of around 15,000 Soviet troops, and destroyed public confidence in the government's ability to lead. Veterans returned home disillusioned, and many young men resisted the draft altogether. By the mid-1980s, the economy was stagnant, poverty was widespread, and the people were tired of sacrificing for a system that seemed incapable of delivering prosperity. Many of the promises of communism, equality, security, and abundance were revealed to be hollow, replaced with empty stores, long lines, and growing frustration. The true breaking point came in 1989. Across Eastern Europe, Soviet satellite states began rejecting communist rule. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and others pushed out pro-Soviet regimes, while in Romania, violent revolution toppled the dictatorship. In Germany, the Berlin Wall, symbol of Soviet dominance, was torn down. People who had been divided for decades could now reunite, and the Soviet Union could do nothing to stop it. Gorbachev, hoping to improve relations with the West, had already reduced the Soviet military presence abroad. When revolts broke out, the Red Army did not intervene. For decades, the fear of Soviet tanks had kept Eastern Europe under control. Without that threat, communist governments collapsed like dominoes. Meanwhile, the Soviet military itself was shrinking. From over 5 million troops in the mid-1980s, numbers dropped to under 3 million by 1991. Economic decline, draft resistance, and arms reduction treaties all weakened the once mighty Red Army. For the first time since World War II, the Soviet Union was no longer seen as an unstoppable giant. Inside the U.S.S.R., ethnic tensions and nationalist movements grew stronger. The Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia declared independence, while unrest spread across Ukraine, Georgia, and Central Asia. In 1991, hardline communists attempted a coup against Gorbachev, but the effort failed and only accelerated the collapse. Finally, on December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned and announced the end of the Soviet Union. That evening, the Soviet flag over the Kremlin was lowered for the last time and replaced with the flag of the Russian Federation. 15 new nations emerged from the ruins of the U.S.S.R., with Boris Yeltsin becoming the first president of an independent Russia. For many, it was the end of an era and the beginning of a completely new world order. Historians still debate the primary cause of the Soviet Union's fall. Some blame Chernobyl, others point to Gorbachev's reforms, while many emphasize economic stagnation or military decline. In reality, it was not one single factor, but a chain reaction. Economic failures led to reforms. Reforms exposed corruption and weakened the Communist Party. Military decline and withdrawal allowed satellite states to break free. Public discontent and ethnic nationalism fractured the Union from within. The collapse of the Soviet Union was the product of decades of mistakes, crises, and miscalculations, an empire undone by both external pressures and its own internal contradictions. It is a reminder that even the mightiest superpowers are not invincible, and that no empire, no matter how strong it seems, lasts forever.